The Harriman Institute at Columbia, our co-sponsor. This is the New York City Russia Public Policy seminar series, and we've been doing this now for about 7 years. And today's seminar is going to be on wartime emigration and the Russian diaspora. Before we get started, I just wanted to thank both the Harriman Institute and the Jordan Center for co-sponsoring this, but also as well to thank the Carnegie Seminar Series and the Carnegie Corporation of New York for its generous funding that allows us to support this series. A little word on logistics. We've invited 4 eminent speakers here today to talk about our topic. We're going to give each of them a chance to make opening remarks. That'll be about 10 to 15 minutes from each of them. While they are making their remarks, you should feel free to use the Q&A button, or if you're watching on YouTube, to use the comment section on YouTube to jot down questions. One of the nice things about the Q&A function is that you don't have to wait until afterwards to ask your question. Anton and I will then afterwards will gather up questions to ask our speakers. So the format will be we'll have the opening presentations from each of the speakers, and then we'll go to questions and moderated discussion. And the session should last approximately about an hour and a half. So thank you so much, all of you, for joining us here today. And I'm going to pass over to my colleague, Anton, to introduce everybody here. Anton?
Thanks, Josh. Hi, everyone. So I'm a postdoctoral scholar at the Harriman Institute. I will be co-moderating the session. And our first speaker is Iveta Sergeyeva. Iveta is currently a visiting scholar at the Harriman Institute at Columbia and a PhD candidate at the European University Institute in Florence. Her work is on political behavior, civil society, and migration, and she's a co-founder of the research project Outrush, which is focused on the new wave of Russian political immigrants. And it is a panel survey that's been going on for a couple of years, and has been covered by the Financial Times, BBC, and various other outlets. So Iveta will talk about this survey, and then we'll talk about the other part of the same study. But for now, let's turn to Iveta. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Anton, and thank you for having me here. I'll start by introducing really quickly the project that we've been working on for 2 years already, and present some insight from this project. And I'll try to focus on the challenges that this migration flow is facing, because I think that this is an important part. So yeah, the project is called Outrush, and it's a panel survey of Russian migrants who left the country following the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The panel component means that we reach out to the same respondents over a regular amount of time, so we can actually trace changes in their life situations, not attributing it to random fluctuations of the sample, which is important. And we started the project in March 2022 with Emil Kamalov, and we've conducted 3 waves of this panel survey in collaboration with Margarita Zavadskaya, who is also here, Nika Kostenko, and Karolina Nugumanova. We currently have more than 10,000 participants all around the globe in this survey, and a large portion of them participates in the panel component of the survey. We also collaborated with Professor Regina Smith on qualitative part. So we collected interviews, but I think that Margarita will talk later about that project. So what we learned so far from the data that we gathered is one thing that I think is quite widely acknowledged already, is that average Russian migrant is quite different from average Russian in terms of age. They're much younger in terms of education. The vast majority of them have higher education, advanced degrees, in terms of economic well-being, and in terms of political activity. And another thing that I also think is quite widely acknowledged, but still worth saying again, that this is not an economic migration in its traditional sense. It's political migration. These people are not trying to increase their household income. Quite the opposite, actually. They're losing money, they're losing status, and they don't see the economic well-being recovering from migration, at least for now. So the main reasons for this migration is political reasons, their disagreements with the regime, and these people will try to stay in migration as long as they could. So for the challenges part, one set of challenges that these people face are coming, of course, from country of origin, Russia. And so there's been a notion that pushing away individuals of that kind, politically active, critically minded, is actually might be a good thing for authoritarian regime, because it helps to stabilize political situation by simply not having enough collective action within the country. But this notion has been challenged, and we now see that politically active migrants can be quite effective troublemakers for regime, even being abroad, effectively exercising their voice and being effective in political mobilization. So for Russian regime, I think that it's only sensible to try to shut down the most active of political migrants, and by using all sorts of repressive techniques. And we see that repressive techniques have been mostly targeted and not been introduced en masse. And I think that may have something to do with Russia being interested in having back at least some of these migrants. At the same time, we see that many designations, such as foreign agent designations or undesirable organization designations that initially were designed to be used within the country, are now broadly used against exiles. And if you're following the list of foreign agents that Russian government lists almost every Friday, you can see that a lot of these people are currently abroad. So we see that some repressive techniques are being quite widely used against these populations. In terms of its effectiveness, what we see is that majority of Russian migrants are currently afraid of repression from Russian government, but it does not necessarily mean that they discourage from political action, because what political science literature tells us is that sometimes repression can help to unite people, to form some sort of common identity, and to mobilize, not to discourage. We'll see how it goes with this flow. For this, another set of challenges are coming from hosting country communities, and hosting countries have their own set of dilemmas in regards to these populations. For some countries, there are, of course, economic gain, and for some countries, even political gain, if they're interested in helping to mobilize this diaspora. At the same time, some countries may consider these people as security threats. And on top of that, being highly educated and competent as they are, they may present competitors on local markets, which host country politicians may face backlash from citizens they may not be happy to deal with in regards to integrating these populations. I think that that may partially explain why we don't see a lot of systemic efforts to integrate these Russian migrants. So in many countries, they are more or less on their own. Another thing that we monitor is the level of discrimination towards them. And I would say that as far as I understand now, level of discrimination towards Russian migrants is a bit higher compared to what migrants in European countries, migrants of other nationalities in European countries usually face. But the good news is that it's coming mostly from local institutions, not from local citizens, and can be attributed possibly to international sanctions that also affect Russian nationals in abroad. I think an important thing is that discrimination may hugely affect integration of Russian migrants. And from our study, we know that discrimination as detrimental for well-being as being unemployed and being fearful of repression from Russian government. So this is something that also should be taken into account while designing policies for integration of these populations. So I think that will be fair to say that these people are now finding themselves between a rock and hard place in terms of they facing challenges from both sides, country of origin and hosting communities. But at least hosting communities, this is something that they can choose. And this explains a lot of commotion around this migration. People are trying to find a place to feel minimally comfortable, to feel minimally safe. And as long as their resources allow it, they will be moving around. And this is something that we also observe, that this migration is quite mobile. I think I'll stop here. And yeah, thank you again for having me here, and to pass it to Margarita, I think.
Thanks very much, Iveta. So our next speaker is Margarita Zawadskaya, who is a senior research fellow at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. She's an accomplished scholar of Russia, Eastern Europe, and autocracies in general, been published in post-Soviet affairs, Europe-Asia studies, and other journals on elections, protests, and recently she started studying Russian immigration, and the part that she'll be talking about is directly related to the project that Iveta is a part of, but Margarita will cover a different part of the story, and she will show some slides. Also, to all the attendees, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A. Margarita?
Okay, thank you very much for having me here. So my apologies for my voice. So it may crack from time to time. I got some cold. So in Finland, it's still cold. It's still close to 0. I think it's much warmer. So I will just continue, and let me just show you some slides, because I think it would give you a better understanding what the kind of this project is about. So I will actually speak on behalf of the Anti-War Commons in Russian Diaspora project, and whose PI is Regina Smith at the University of Indiana, Bloomington. So who actually kindly delegated me the task to tell you a bit more of that part of this bigger endeavor. So this is generally a collaborative effort aiming at gathering a comprehensive archive or corpus, text corpus, of semi-structured interviews in 6 most popular destinations for Russian political exiles. So I use the term political exiles quite, I would say, on purpose, since Iveta already provided like a lot of evidence that this is not an economic out-migration, so it's clearly politically motivated, and we broadly published on that, providing as much evidence as possible. So I think this is something that we don't need to prove anymore, at least at this point. So we focus on these 3 countries because they turned out to be the most kind of convenient destinations. And under the auspice of this project, we seek to also, apart from collecting interviews, we also kind of aim at creating and generating a map of anti-war commons. This term is borrowed from Elinor Ostrom's theoretical framework. And also we kind of looking to catalog the transnational repression, the kind of long-arm authoritarian regime that is trying to reach out to those political exiles. So this is something that is relatively new, because in the beginning of the full-scale invasion, I think the overall attitudes of the Russian state towards those who emigrated was like, okay, let them go. So those who emigrated, they don't pose any tangible political threat anymore. But now, given the infamously known posts by Dmitry Medvedev and other Russian officials, so we all know that the Russian state made a U-turn probably around 1.5 years. So, and now the Russian state, actually, together with Belarus and a couple of other states, they're kind of innovating in the realm of how to reach out to those populations and kind of, disincentivize them to engage in civic and political activities, especially when it comes to politically sensitive issues such as the war in Ukraine, which is, I would say, to say at least a big deal for Vladimir Putin. So this is why it's a very sensitive and politically sensitive topic and issue. So we were lucky because we launched the project exactly at the moment when people were eager to talk to us. And actually now it's a little bit more difficult to make people speak, especially in countries like Kyrgyzstan or Kazakhstan, because the political landscape in those countries is a bit different from Georgia or Serbia. So we also actually have plenty of evidence of infiltration, espionage, and some other undermining activities from the Russian state, especially in Serbia, by the way, and also some nasty cases of people being extradited back to Russian state from Kyrgyzstan. And Armenia, we're still trying to fight for those Russian emigres. So there was so far only one case of a person being extradited at the moment. But it's a question of Armenian state capacity, to what extent they can resist the pressure from the Russian side to kind of have to prosecute Russian political activists. So this is a short map, so it gives you some overview how many Russians or Russian speakers or people who identify themselves as Russian on the eve before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So Kazakhstan is clearly a leading country here with 21% of overall population. Then comes Kyrgyzstan. So we also need to remember that majority of people in Kyrgyzstan, they also speak Russian in everyday life, especially in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan's capital. In Georgia, Armenia, so the percentage of Russians is significantly lower. And finally, there is this blue part on the map. So this is Serbia. It also turned out to be one of the most popular and convenient destinations. But actually, the amount of people who arrived there happened with some lag. So, I mean, the most popular destination probably was Turkey, Kazakhstan, and Georgia. But then later on, Serbia kind of got more credentials in the eyes of Russian political exiles. When it comes to data collection and overall description of the text corpus we have at our disposal at the moment. So we basically have around 500, not around, it's precise number, 583 semi-structured interviews. We contacted slightly more people at 674 potential informants. So you see that our success rate is relatively high. So we managed to establish trust kind of relationship of trust with our informants. It's also mostly thanks to the Outrash project that carefully, I would say, gently treats their respondents and actually kind of sends separate reports to them. So we kind of, as scholars, are being held accountable to the people we're working for. So in this sense, this endeavor is kind of a semi-academic, and also it's deeply entrenched in, I really like to call it evidence-based policymaking. So the way we recruited our respondents is a combination of kind of short follow-up Qualtrics survey administered by Outrash people and among their panelists. And it makes a great share, alliance share of our sample. And with subsequent snowballing. And we also kind of, in the end of our field work, when we kind of reached the plateau, when we realized that probably it's got a bit more difficult to recruit new people. So we also took advantage of some local scholars as intermediaries to go beyond our bubbles, so to speak. So as you can see from the figure, so the people who end up in Georgia were the most enthusiastic in talking to us. So it's like about 32%. It turned out to be a bit of a problem because our resulting sample turned out to be a bit skewed. So, and this is why we really tried to kind of, slow down on Georgia and recruit more people from Kyrgyzstan. Kyrgyzstan turned out to be the most challenging site for us since this is one of the least secure place for Russian political exile, especially those who actually were political activists 24/7. So this is why actually it turned out to be like a temporary base for those people, and they actually tried their best to move on somewhere to a safer place like Georgia to obtain humanitarian visa, or at least to Georgia, because again, so Georgia seems to be still kind of a relatively safe haven for political activists. So this is kind of an overall description of our data. So the kind of themes we covered. So since this is it's more of a pool of data that can help us addressing various topics. So we basically ask the people's trajectories or the main push factors, how they describe their own experiences, why they decided to emigrate, why they changed their initial location, and what's actually their hopes for the future. So the question of self-identification, whether they identify themselves with exiters or with the remainers. So what is the relationship between them and homeland? So did they kind of sever ties with homeland, or are they still kind of seeking to, I don't know, like remit back to their homeland? They did not lose hope. And this is something that I'm personally very interested in. Of course, we also ask questions about political attitudes of all sorts, like gender equality, or what's the attitudes towards Putin Russian political regime, or transitional justice, if it happens to be the case. so there is like a lot of questions, and I also would like to emphasize that we have a special block of questions devoted to IT specialists, since these group of population of Russian immigrants is of particular strategic importance for the Russian state, since these are the, in Russian we call it like специалисты двойного назначения, so these are specialists actually with dual purposes. They can also be deployed in the defense sector. So this is why we have a special subsection for targeting those people and actually see how they see themselves in these new realities, what their aspirations, to what extent they are afraid for the long arm of the Russian state, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's something that is of extremely high policy relevance. And of course, vision of Russian future. And actually it leads us to probably the last thing I would like to share with you, some highlights for one of the works in progress I'm doing at the moment together with my colleague. So to what extent this vision of Russia's future and political representation, so whether people feel represented by anyone from the Russian opposition or they just withdrew themselves from the Russian political community at all, how exactly it affects the patterns of political remittances. So, and let me just briefly share some very early preliminary highlights. I even don't call it findings or results whatsoever. Is based on the manual coding of the 1/3 of the interviews I outlined above. So I did old school way with the use of AI, built an engine in the Atlas TI software. So, and basically I was looking at to what extent people, what makes people donate to the Russian civil society organizations, why they did not break ties with their homeland or whoever is actually still serves as the kind of intermediary between Russia and their new places of residence. So, and here I was looking at the two relatively low cost options of political engagement or civic engagement. I use the term political very broadly. So this is the self-reported donations. We know, but probably some people may overestimate their engagement because this is something that is socially desirable, especially in Georgia, for instance. You must do something in order to kind of prove your right to stay in Georgia. At least that's what I learned during my field work 1 year ago. Then we also kind of ask whether people talk to their families, whether they still talk to their friends, and how often they do that. It sounds like a very innocent and apolitical endeavor, but apparently plays one of the huge roles in kind of, keeping ties and not kind of, preventing people from abandoning and from kind of, withdrawing from the Russian political context completely. And this is of essential importance if we know and understand anything about the role of diasporas in democratization process back in their homeland. So this is something that plays a huge role. So here actually I found out that there are at least 3 strategies that affect the way people engage in political remittances. The first strategy is withdrawal. People just sever all the ties with homeland. They don't want to have anything in common with their country. They feel ashamed, and actually they just look towards integrating the new in the countries of residence, or they just aspiring to get to a better place, like Germany. So it's one of the most popular and desirable destination, or Spain, or United States, etc. So the second strategy is the aligning with the opposition. So some of our informants, they kind of pick their fighter, whether it's feminist anti-war resistance or Khodorkovsky structures or Navalny or anyone else, or Maxim Katz actually, or actually some bloggers turned out to be quite popular. And this is how they kind of rebuild a political connection with their homeland. So this is a second strategy. And finally, this is a kind of attempt to rebuild a new community abroad. So we are Russians outside Russia. So we're not the Russians who actually stayed there. And the last Outrush report actually beautifully shows us this trend that kind of those who left Russia, they kind of seek to depart from their homeland to kind of, draw the boundary, symbolic boundary. Yes, we are Russians, but we are different ones. Of course, they don't use the term good Russians because it was kind of it suffers severe reputation costs in the beginning of the full-scale invasion. But they're seeking to build kind of new diasporas abroad with a better reputation from scratch. And this is why they donate only to those organizations who actually are not operating for the sake of Russian domestic politics or domestic activities. They donate to Kovchek because they help Russian immigrants, but they do not donate to Medusa, for instance. So this is kind of a third quite interesting strategy. So I think I will stop here. And before actually I say my last sentence, so this is a little bit of shameless self-promotion. So it's actually our joint publication with the Outrush team and Regina Smith's team. please visit the Ponar's website. So there are like at least a few policy memos where we nicely lay out our descriptive statistics and kind of provide our insights into how to handle Russian political immigration in the current circumstances. So that's all from me. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Margarita, for this very important insights. So we'll shift gears a little bit now, and our next speaker is Elizaveta Osetinskaya, who's an award-winning media manager and entrepreneur with more than 20 years of experience in this field. She was chief editor of various highly important Russian independent news outlets, including RBC, Forbes Russia, Vedomosti, and more recently, she's been a fellow in journalism fellowship programs at Stanford and Berkeley. And currently, she is the founder and the leader of the new independent outlet, The Bell, which produces news and analysis for both Russian readers and international readers about Russia. It has both Russian and English language versions. And we asked Elizaveta to talk about her experiences working with Russian audiences abroad, and in general, speaking to people, to Russians who are critically minded. Elizaveta, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Anton. Thank you for this representation. I also want to add that Bell, from the very beginning, was founded in 2017, focused on westernized, global-minded Russians. So people who either considered or already lived abroad, or considered living abroad, or lived for 2 countries or more countries. And it's focused on entrepreneurs, people working on their personal success, business people, and high-paid managers. So what is unique for me about current anti-war immigration is that there are a lot of people of our audience in the group of who left Russia these times. And compared to previous waves where there were a lot of cultural leaders, opposition leaders, today these people left Russia because it's nearly too impossible to reach their goals inside the country. What do I mean? I mean that if they wanted to build internationally, globally recognized companies, it was possible to have either offices or IT developers or even headquarters inside Russia. I know such examples from my interviews, which I conducted probably more than 150 for my YouTube channel. So today is absolutely impossible to build global company focused on global markets inside the country. And for those people who persuade such goals, for them it's better to start the new page from scratch rather than continue building that in Russia. So the community of entrepreneurs divided, and here I include also IT specialists or people, creative people who surround this business community. For them, it's kind of a difficult choice. They need either continue living inside the country, or they need just to stop it for their aspirations and inspirations about their business and future. So also I call this immigration silent immigration, because most of these people don't speak. They don't talk publicly about their situations, and many of them pretend not to be affiliated with Russia anymore, because due to sanctions, there are a lot of troubles and complexity for people deciding to build a company, but having Russian red passport. So, for example, if you want to start a new company and open bank account, it's incredibly complicated to do so. For example, I know one entrepreneur who went to bank and tried to open account 13 times before he reached success with his new company. So in my observations, those people will wait for 5 to 7 years, and this is normal time based on cultural shock term. So this is normal timing. They will look at situation in Russia. If this country can turn into normal, better place for them to persuade their goals, they will consider coming back. But apparently, we don't see any signs of this in coming years. So most likely, these people will melt into their new societies, and they will integrate with or without help of hosting countries, but to develop the projects and establish their lives on their new places, they will have to do so. And here we switch to a very interesting situation with media. We also observe absolutely unique situation when almost every anti-government or opposition media had to leave country in 2022 because reporting in a normal way was equal to breaking Russian new laws and made these actions illegal. So now we observe the situation while about 40 independent media moved into exile. That's so, and we not only talking about niche media like The Bell, but also we talking about huge and general interest media like Meduza, TV Rain, Novaya Gazeta, and so on. And this is very interesting situation between this new immigration, people inside the country, and this media. Talking about people who are immigrants, new immigrants, they of course are the readers and supporters of those media, but I don't think, and I doubt that they need all 40. I think they can pick one or two, given that in the future they are going to integrate into the new places. So they probably need to be connected to their home country and get some news and get some confirmation that they made right steps while they left. But they need maybe one or two, maximum 3 medias to get all the information they need. Of course, there are some new media for immigrants that were created after 24th of February 2022, such as Volna, such as Kovчег, semi-media like Bridge community, or for example, social chats like Serbinovo in Serbia or Sean in Berlin that was created by Meduza. But still, if these people want to integrate and or they need to integrate, this media will not represent them. So summarizing all that, if we are talking about major audience of independent exiled media in this amount, the major audience is still in Russia. And this is a huge challenge and unique situation that most everyone who delivers independent information is outside the country. And here we come to a number of challenges that these media outlets face. First of all, is a question, of course, with all techniques of internet and social media, how can we keep relevance to day-to-day needs of our audience inside the country? So how can media get scoops and interesting facts being outside of their homeland country? And this challenge certainly is not solved. And the gap between needs of the audience and ability of this exiled media to satisfy these needs is increasing, apparently. And from one side, from another side, we shouldn't forget about so-called well-established Russian media that still exist and sometimes try to satisfy this demand. So, and in some ways, even being under hard censorship, they still trying to do some job and report something that they can. And another question is, what is anything about war crimes and various dramas in Russia, in Russian life, this exiled media can deliver to Russian audience? So is for them relevant to report about day-to-day life of common Russians? And also the question is, how should they overcome so-called Russian sovereign internet that is limiting, blocking websites, and making other obstacles for exiled media to report? And the fourth major question is, who should finance this media? Because of course, business model for media is broken all over the world, but in Russian market, there are some specific limitations for such operators. For example, making media non-desirable organization completely limit every way of monetizing this work inside the country. Also, calling for an agent, calling company or person for an agent, totally limit every possibility to make money inside the country. I mean, advertising money. So, and now we have this balance also between very limited audience outside of Russia, which is able to support Russian media in exile, and sometimes has will and intention to do so. But in general, the general roadmap of this audience is different, because this audience, as I said previously, from after a certain amount of time, will integrate their new homes, and much bigger Russian audience that technically has very limited number of options to support this independent media in exile. So probably I have to stop here, not to overload you with the information and troubles of Russian media. So feel free to ask questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizaveta. This has been super insightful. So now we move on to the more historical perspective. And our next speaker is Eric Scott, who is an associate professor of history and the director of the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies at the University of Kansas. He's a historian of modern Russia, the Soviet Union, and the Cold War. And he's the author of two important books, one of which has just come out, which is called Defectors: How the Illicit Flight of Soviet Citizens Built the Borders of the Cold War World. So it is essentially about the previous generations of political exiles from Russia. Before I move on to Professor Scott, let me just encourage everyone put their questions in the chat and in the Q&A. And with that, I will move on to Eric. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Anton. And thank you to the Harriman Institute and the Jordan Center for organizing this. It's really exciting to be here. As a historian, I'm also often focused on the past, and so it's really exciting to see what research is being done to understand the current Russian emigration. And also as a historian of the Cold War, but also migration, it's been really hard not to notice how the past echoes are reaching us in looking at the current wave of emigration. Just like during the Cold War, this decision to leave is often framed as a political choice. Just as during the Cold War, emigres are often described or imagined as representing an opposition force, but also an alternative Russia. And just like in the Cold War, Moscow has become increasingly bold in targeting emigre opponents abroad. And since, for historians at least, the Cold War was not all that long ago, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that this is also part of a much longer term history that stretches back to the 19th century and carried on into the fate of emigres after the Bolshevik siege of power in 1917, particularly struck by the flight of emigres to places like the Baltic states, to Georgia, to Germany and Serbia, which was very similar to what we saw after 1917. And of course, a spirited but divided world of Russian emigre politics is part of a much longer tradition that goes back to the 19th century. So in my remarks, I want to focus on three main areas where I think my intervention as a historian might be most useful. First, in looking at patterns of emigration. Second, in looking at this new international context and how it compares to what we saw previously. And third, how we can understand the Russian state's responses to the challenge of emigration. So first, when it comes to patterns of emigration, it's worth asking who's leaving, where are they going, and why are they going? And I think the survey that was just described gives a much more detailed view of who's leaving. But I think what's striking to me is that we see, as in the past, the departure of those with the means to do so. And this is common among studies of migration, right? Migrants are often persecuted and facing all kinds of challenges, but those who are able to leave have some sort of connection or possibility to do so. So certainly we see this with people with pre-existing international connections, with specialists, including those in the IT sector. We see also the departure of young men of fighting age, which is totally logical, but also fits with Cold War era patterns of defection from the Soviet Union. And in that period, during the Cold War, you saw preference given for defectors and emigres with employable skills or young men of fighting age who otherwise would have served in the Soviet army. We also see the departure of families, which was certainly unusual when it came to unauthorized flight from the Soviet Union, but much more typical when it came to the authorized but heavily restricted exodus of Soviet Jews that began in the late 1960s. And what's really different now is the relative porousness of Russia's borders. So there's various estimates, and the number is hard to count, but if we imagine around 1 million Russian citizens having left since 2022, to put this in perspective, this is 3 times the number of Jews who left the Soviet Union between 1970 and 1988. So it's an incredibly large emigration in historical terms. I think what's perhaps most different, though, is not that well, in addition to Russians being freer to leave, the hesitancy of countries to take them in. So today it's really more Schengen and American visa rules rather than Russian emigration restrictions that prevent Russians from reaching the West. While Soviets who defected to the West during the Cold War were viewed as brave opponents of Moscow and almost immediately given shelter, some of those who flee now are asked why they didn't stay in Russia to overthrow Putin. And I found this sentiment to be particularly expressed in Georgia, where I've spent some time over the past 2 summers. And also striking are the policies of some countries that are opposing Russia, but also don't want Russian migrants. Finland, which recently joined NATO, is actually now considering legislation that would allow Russian asylum seekers to be sent back to Russia without processing their asylum claims. So it's a very different international context in comparison to the Cold War, when there was some preferences given to Soviet citizens in the international asylum and refugee system. And so in many ways, Russians are now being treated like other groups of migrants around the world, and less likely to be given preferential treatment. And, you know, as someone who's written a book about defectors, I think it's striking how rarely these terms of defection or escape are used. I mean, I've seen them used only in regards to Russian military intelligence officials who have fled. And so this is a very different context and a very different framework. And this I think explains why Russians tend to go to countries that will take them, to Turkey, which was mentioned, Georgia and Armenia, but also much more broadly to Argentina, to the United Arab Emirates, and other countries. In terms of why people are leaving, you know, and I'd love to sort of talk more about the survey. As a historian of migration, I tend to see the reasons why people leave and the reasons why people do many things as very complex, a complex mix of motivations, of push and pull factors. So certainly not wanting to discount increased repression, the war against Ukraine, and the military mobilization. I think there's also other factors at play here. And economic and political motivations are highly intertwined. During the Cold War, when the Soviet ideology was bound up in a particular kind of economic system, flight from the Soviet Union because of economic conditions could be cast as a political choice. And now in today's Russia, I mean, the linkages of economic sanctions as a political tool, you know, shows how this intertwining of politics and economics, and even the most politically active emigres are also economic actors too. And so I think, you know, I really think it's very difficult to disaggregate these. I think it's, you know, you can ask people what they think, how they represent themselves. There are major incentives for people to represent themselves primarily as political actors. This is true for seeking asylum. This is also true for establishing credibility. There's often this idea that people today are not as political as past waves, and this you could see even in the 1980s, when people leaving the Soviet Union in the 80s were disparagingly described sometimes as kolbasnaya emigratsiya. So people leaving because of shortages. But I really think people's motivations are complex, and we shouldn't be so quick to say whether it's political or economic. It is some combination, and economic migrants can have a very important political role too. When it comes to the context in which they find themselves, I think you know, it's obviously very different, and it depends on the country, and you know, and I think their experiences will probably be sort of placed on different trajectories depending where they are. If they're in Georgia, they're likely to be criticized for not being anti-Putin enough, whereas in Serbia, they might encounter locals who like Putin more than they do. And so I think it's perhaps difficult to think of them as a single wave. And I have some critiques of the general wave paradigm that historians use to talk about Russian emigration, because within each wave, there's really ideologically, ethnically, and socially diverse groups of migrants who not only don't necessarily associate with each other, but often don't like each other. And you also have a blurring of waves with many of the so-called second wave that came after World War II, containing first wave migrants who were first displaced to, say, the former Yugoslavia or to Poland, and then displaced a second time to the US. And so, as was the case in the past, you arguably have not one diaspora, but many different diasporas with competing emigre organizations that are clamoring to speak on their behalf. And so constructing a Russian diaspora is very much a political project. And I don't mean this as necessarily a bad thing, that it's politically and socially constructed, but just that this is an ongoing project with certain entrepreneurs in the diaspora who are organizing this, and perhaps an inverse reflection of Putin's project to claim a Ruski Mir beyond Russia's borders, to speak on behalf of these diverse groups of Russians. And compared to the Cold War period, I think emigre organizations have some new and important technologies to reach more people around the world, but they face some of the same challenges in terms of uniting a diverse and scattered community. They also face some of the same challenges from the Russian state. And I think it's here where you see the greatest continuity with the Cold War period. Moscow is not or cannot restrict exit as it once did, but it's continuing its longstanding efforts to police emigre communities abroad. And so emigres are politically active emigres in particular are surveilled, in which case social media helps them a lot. But there's also more old school means of surveilling, including tailing people in the emigration. This has been reported increasingly in Yerevan. And while I don't have access to Russian intelligence files, I would wager that there are ongoing efforts to infiltrate emigre groups with agents and to plant Russian intelligence operatives in the emigration. And I imagine too that as in the past, these intelligence gathering efforts are coordinated with the foreign ministry and Russia's network of embassies and consulates. In some ways, and it'd be interesting to see if we see some earlier speakers talked about perhaps a changing policy toward emigration. I think there's an ongoing debate that harkens back to the 1970s among Russian policymakers and intelligence officials about whether it's better to keep people from leaving or to expel people abroad. In the 1970s, you saw a shift from preventing emigration to actually forcing people to emigrate, including the author Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And I think the argument would go that when people are exiled, they lose contact with their constituency, they lose contact to relevant information, and they can be sort of pushed out of the scene. Although Solzhenitsyn's works certainly had a big impact abroad. I think we can also see this tension in terms of how Alexei Navalny was navigating and making his decision and ultimately deciding to return to face prison and ultimately death rather than remain outside of Russia, where he would be marginalized as a political force. And so this is an ongoing debate, I think, about whether emigration is a sort of political risk, or whether emigration can be used as a safety valve to sort of manage politics. We've certainly seen a much harder line against intelligence officers and soldiers who are fleeing, while the CIA has encouraged defection from Russian intelligence, and while Ukraine, likely with U.S. assistance, has encouraged the desertion of Russian soldiers. The recent assassination of Maxim Kuzminov, who was a Russian helicopter pilot who fled to Ukraine, sends a very clear signal to those who would follow him, and also speaks to the failure of Western intelligence to offer protection. And so this I think is a sign of increased boldness, and perhaps maybe part of a broader pattern where it's not just Russia, but also states like Saudi Arabia and even India that feel emboldened to target and assassinate opponents abroad. So to conclude, I think this emigration is historic in terms of its numbers, but facing some of the similar political constraints and perhaps some new constraints as well in a post-Cold War context. And it remains an open question of how long this diaspora will remain abroad. As Elizaveta mentioned, as time goes by, its members will have to choose how much they and their children integrate into the countries where they find themselves, assuming that there is a path to integration in these countries. Unlike in the past, it is much easier for them to remain in touch with friends and family who are still in Russia. And it'll be interesting to see as time goes by, and particularly if mobilization is ended or the war continues to drag on at a low level, what the calculus is in terms of returning to Russia or staying abroad. I think what's clear is that they'll continue to occupy this liminal position held by past diasporas from Russia and the Soviet Union. As the 19th century emigre Alexander Herzen, the founder of the first Bell publication, described the situation of being foreigners at home and strangers abroad. And I think this position of liminality is a source of instability and and uncertainty, but also one hopes a source of political creativity for Russia's future. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thanks so much, Eric. Thanks all of you for such insightful presentations. I've learned a ton. I have a whole long list of questions that I want to ask that I'm not going to be able to get to all of them. I do want to remind people, if you're in the audience and you have a question, and you can put it up in the Q&A, as well. If you're watching on YouTube, you can put it in the chat. I think I want to start building off of something Eric was talking about at the end, about like the motivations of the exile community, and I want to ask the question of, when we, at some points in the discussion, it sounded like we were verging into an assumption that anyone who left the country could be considered part of a Russian opposition or potential Russian opposition. And what I want to ask is whether that is a correct assumption. Is it useful to think of imputing that if you weren't opposed to the Putin regime, you would have stayed? And so therefore, when we think about the exile community, we think of all these people as potential opposition, regardless of how much they vary. And of course, everyone does vary in how much they're actually participating in opposition actively. Or is it the case that there are, in this, as Eric was saying, about not wanting to think about these as a uniform wave, that there are, in this period of expanded migration, this high level of migration we've seen in the last year and a half, the last 2 years, whether there are people in there who really wouldn't consider themselves supportive of the opposition, but they've left either for economic reasons, because the type of work they do has gotten harder to do in Russia, or they left because, say, they didn't want to be drafted, but they don't really expand on that. So those of you, maybe I'll direct this first to the two of you who are involved in doing interviews and surveys. But how do you think about this? Do we think about the Russian exile community? Do we assume these are all opposition or potential opposition, or is that not a good assumption? Maybe you want to go first. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I'll start. The statistic says that these people are quite critical towards Russian political institutions, but what it means in terms of the actual political participation, I think that may be quite nuanced. And this is something that Margarita has already quite nicely laid out in terms of the remittances, for example, what kind of risk these people would accept in being politically active. Our recent research shows that people can be quite engaged politically, but if they feel safe enough in doing it, for example, being able to donate anonymously, being able not to trace back in these donations, and things like that. From research that our colleague Svetlana Rusishvili been doing in Latin America, we also know that many people who fled to Latin American countries would not consider themselves political opposition and would definitely stay away from political activities, but then they would but in the interviews, in that conversation, they would say that actually a lot of reasons why they fled the country connected to political situation. So I think that this question may be a bit more nuanced in terms of how actually people are participating and whether they consider themselves or not political opposition. And it's also, I think, connected a lot with whether they had previous activism in Russia or not, or whether they have to develop these skills from scratch.
Okay, so I take your answer to be that assumption is mainly correct. There might be some people who don't think of themselves as opposition, but even those folks tend to be fairly critical of what's going on and what led them to leaving. Margarita, do you have the same take on that?
Well, this actually was the first question I asked myself. So we, in the very first wave of the Outrush survey, there was a straightforward question. So what actually made you leave the country? So, and then we kind of got stuck when we look at the first distribution. So, I mean, the reasons were mixed. So, and the majority of respondents, Vieta, please correct me if I forgot the numbers, but we were like, okay, we can't really make any out of this. So, and then I asked myself, okay, why are we so interested in that? So, and here I think it really depends on where we stand when we ask this question. So if these are purely economic migrants, again, it still has very serious political implications. So from the policy point of view, from the sanctions, and if we kind of, as policymakers or some countries, we seek kind of to drain Russia from of resources. Okay, it's a good thing. It doesn't matter whether they are politically motivated or they're driven purely by economic reasons, or they are actually relocated by the IT companies. So it doesn't really matter. So it kind of involves this ethics or moral argument. So are these people like good people deep inside or not? So, and to me, it's kind of a pretty meaningless question, since we cannot really know and why. So here I completely agree with Eric. So these motivations are so deeply intertwined, and it's really hard to know. And so I actually stopped asking myself this question, but it's clearly, even if this mix of motivation is unclear for our informants themselves, it's what is really important is the environment, political environment they find themselves after immigration. Because again, as my field trip in Georgia, probably Eric also had very similar insights, there is a lot of pressure upon these people to kind of reconsider their experiences, or to demonstrate, or to perform in a certain way. In Serbia, these pressures are quite different. In Finland, again, you're supposed to be expected to perform, or you're expected to say certain things to kind of send a signal that you're credible. So again, it doesn't really matter what was in the beginning. So what really matters actually how these motivations are being reshaped after immigration. So this is why political opportunity structure for civil societies plays a huge role here, and it's something to take a look. We need to take a look at.
Okay, thanks. Elizabeth, can I ask you a question now more focused on the exiled media? And I guess the question that I'm wondering here, and I think there's like a financial component to it and an editorial component to it. But at what point do exiled journalists begin to focus more on the experience of the exile community than they do on what is happening back in Russia? Is this a transition that happens gradually? Is it a transition that doesn't happen at all? That the reason you're exiled media is because you're trying to get out what's happening in Russia to the diaspora community that wants to know better? You're trying to report, unfettered news back into Russia? Or does at some point, if it becomes, now we're going on over 2 years, as this begins to expand, one of the discussions here earlier was talking about like this idea of creating, I think it was in Margarita's remarks about the strategy of creating a community abroad, a new community abroad. At some point, does the exile media begin to serve those new communities abroad? And then financially, in terms of the modern, and I work on studying internet technologies, and financially, is there enough support? Can you get enough clicks on media to support advertising if you're either choosing to target the exile community abroad and the interests of the exile community abroad, as opposed to sort of reporting on news in Russia? Or alternatively, if the Russian government gets better and better at blocking, so it gets harder and harder to get web traffic from within Russia, and so your audience becomes mainly people who are in the community. So it's looping a couple of different themes together, but I'm kind of very interested in your thoughts on that.
Well, all your questions are very, very interesting and insightful, because it's exactly what we are all thinking now. I will start from the last question, because it's on the tip of my fingers. So, because now thinking about new business model, we were trying to estimate the size of the Russian-speaking audience outside of Russia, and we are trying to understand, with given we have 500,000 subscribers on YouTube, how many people we need, and how many advertisers we need, and what kind of CPM and what pricing we need to make it viable without any support. And my rough answer is this is not working with these numbers, because the most common situation which we have is that we have, let's say, companies focused on high net worth Russians, but they are mostly inside Russia or close to Russia. And those organizations want to sell something to this kind of people. Because if we are talking about like selling goods and services through advertising, you need a huge number of sales items physically. If you sell running shoes Adidas, so you need like a million of views and dozens of thousands clicks to make your model viable. So with the high priced goods and services, like, for example, bank accounts or real estate. You need high net worth individuals who are able to buy this. So math doesn't work here, unfortunately. So this audience outside of Russia is not big enough. So coming back to your first question, I think it's a very personal question from media to media. I see that people, because you said it's just 2 years, but 2 years is enough if you are talking about personal life, not about like the research or like historical process of Russian immigration that is like 100 or 150 years long. So if we're talking about these 2 years, people started thinking, okay, it seems that I'm here for longer than I expected. So maybe I need to continue talking to audience inside Russia, but I need to find my way of living here. So maybe I'll try some Russian-speaking media for immigrants. And this is how those medias like Sean, founded by Meduza founders, not Meduza like entity, but Meduza founders, or like Volna Wave, it's called, started. So I think it will be developing gradually. So step by step. But I still see that most of media trying to do their work focusing on Russian audience, because people who left and medias that left, they were and they are mission driven. And if we are looking at this, mission is still inside Russia. So the key mission, especially after what we've seen, what we saw during Navalny funeral, we clearly saw that there are a huge amount of people who really require support from somewhere, and their lack of support inside the country. So the only medias and mediums that we can rely are outside. And since journalism as a profession is very mission driven, I think it was like a new injection of enthusiasm for exiled media to continue doing their job, communicating with Russian audience inside the country.
Thank you. So we have a couple of questions in the Q&A. I think they're actually pretty much connected, and also connected to a question I had. It is about the political activity and political activism among immigrants and their impact on what's going on in Russia. So one question to Iveta is by Masha Lvova, and it is, you said Russian politically active migrants can be quite efficient even abroad. Can you give a few examples? And I think in general, it's interesting to talk about in what ways these immigrants can influence political life and politics in general back in Russia. To what extent they can be influential. And the second question, which is on sort of the other side of this, is by Marina Mikhailova. And the question to Eric is, could you discuss the reason for the shift from seeing Soviet immigrants as defectors to encouraging Russian immigrants today to stay and fight against the regime? Is it just a function of the end of the Cold War ideology and opposition to the Soviet regime, or are there any other factors? So I think it's interesting to discuss to what extent the Western policy as well should be targeted towards immigrants, towards people who are back in Russia, and how they can balance that. So let's start with Iveta.
Thank you. So I think the interesting part of the question, should be deemed as efficient political action, and whether we should whether we should speak about something that is intentional political action or something that people are just doing but have some political consequences. For example, political remittances, or just staying in touch with relatives and friends in Russia and talking with them about politics. According to some political science researchers, may have at least some correlations with democratizations in country. And this is something that people don't usually do intentionally, although they can engage with in intentional political activities such as expatriate voting or donating money to organizations in exile. I think that this migration is kind of unique to think about what can be expected from them in terms of political effectiveness, because it's really well connected, both these people in Russia and transnationally within the diaspora itself. And maybe these connectivities with advancement, this technological advancement may show some, what Eric said, political creativity in this diaspora, something that definitely we can follow and see.
Thank you. Eric, let's go to you, and maybe you could touch on this as well, if you'd like, on political activism.
Sure. So, I mean, I think the question is a really good one about why we see this shift from seeing Soviets as defectors to encouraging Russians to potentially stay and fight against the regime. This is actually was a debate during the Cold War as well, and the whole defector paradigm really only came about and was maintained thanks to a good deal of policy coordination. The U.S. really pushed this interpretation. It supported an asylum system internationally to receive what were called escapees, and it really highlighted the emigration restrictions that kept most Soviet citizens inside the Soviet Union, so they could be portrayed as captives in their own country. And so that's obviously all shifted, and there's no longer, I think, a consistent messaging around this. Instead, you see lots of debates that were occurring under the surface in the Cold War, but never really came to the surface. So lots of debates about whether this is part of a longer-term pattern of the war is part of a longer-term pattern of Russian imperialism. Lots of different interpretations of migrants, very little coordinated international support for Russian migrants in particular, certainly compared to what we see that's out there to support those refugees from Ukraine. And so I think in some ways these are longer standing tensions around migrants in general that were kept under the surface of debates during the Cold War, because there was really consistent messaging around this issue. And this is one of the most striking changes for me, is this shift in this sense that people should stay and fight, when in fact, I think that's easier said than done. And I think the opportunities for political activism, perhaps in the emigration now, or there might be new opportunities, and particularly with the porousness of borders. I know there's increasing restrictions on media, but still, in some ways easier to get information back and forth than it was during the Cold War.
Thank you. Another question we have is about, so Margarita talked about, how new immigrants are trying to figure out their vision for Russia. So do we have a sense of what this vision is, and is there even a vision to talk about? And I think, Elizaveta, if you'd like to weigh in on this as well, based on your knowledge of your audience, it would be interesting too.
This is a great question. So let me, before I kind of try to answer whether this is really a vision or whatever it is. So why is it important? So from my perspective, I look at this kind of people's participation of what Russian future might look like. It's a kind of investment logic. So it makes sense for me to invest in something that I believe will survive, or I believe looks like a viable project. If I believe that one day Russia will become democratic, or how Navalny described it, or I don't know, whoever else described it. So this is actually defines the way I donate, and it defines the way I kind of politically remit, the kind of message I transfer when I communicate, for instance, with either like my grandmom somewhere in Ulyanovsk or wherever she is. So that's the kind of logic I kind of imply when I say vision. So I'm not saying like vision in the highbrow term of the word. So what I mean here is basically what people really believe in. So if they don't really believe in the Russian project, or Russia as a comfortable place for them to live. So, and then it means that actually they would probably are more likely donate or remit to the kind of assist the civic organizations or media or NGOs that actually help refugees, asylum seekers, or those who are abroad, without investing into those activities that still kind of target domestic politics. And I think this is a very important distinction that is very often omitted when we discuss like political remittances, democratization, what diaspora can do for that. So there is a lot of informants in our sample that actually provide assistance to those diaspora organizations and not to those organizations that actually target domestic politics. In this sense, it actually is not even a political remittance in a way. So this is a kind of message I was trying to deliver. What kind of Russia do they envision? Well, probably most majority of them, they don't know themselves, but again, they actually tell us what they believe to be a viable option for them.
Thank you, Elizaveta.
Yes, let me add a little bit on that. I think the vision of future of Russia is the hardest question that had been hardest question before the war, and maybe before revolution of whatever 1991 or Russian Revolution back in 1917. So talking seriously, I think Russian society abroad is strongly divided on this. And there is a political representation, political group of political activists that have a lot of thoughts and conversations about vision of future Russia, but they do not represent anyone, even in immigration community. Because compared to Belarus, where Belarusian opposition leaders have legitimate representation and they have semi-legitimate leader, Russian opposition, especially now after killing of Alexei Navalny, doesn't have any legitimate representation. This is the problem. So when all people I well respect gather together, I ask them inside me whom they represent. People outside of Russia, but they're focusing, nobody basically represent people, most of the people outside of Russia who are struggling with many troubles and obstacles due to sanctions, due to that they change their lives. Sometimes they don't have enough savings and so on. And they don't represent Russians inside Russia either. So that's because for one reason is objective, because they never had chance to represent anyone because they were not allowed to go through election process. But also there is a question of real support and how can we measure this. So that's why this vision of future Russia is very, very fragile and unrealistic. Not just because we are the future is our desirable future is so unrealistic, but because of implementation of this potential future.
I want to shift gears a little bit here and bundle a few questions that I have, all that are slightly different questions, but they're all around this topic that many of you discussed, which is this increasing level of repression of the exile community outside of Russia. So I have three questions, and maybe they're, you should definitely not feel compelled to answer all of them, and maybe some of them are better directed at different ones of you. First question is as someone who's trying to understand how this is likely to evolve in the future, should we be thinking about this, and I think at least one of you mentioned this during your remarks, should we be thinking about this in the long term as a phenomenon that's going to vary across context of the host country? So is this a phenomenon where we see exiles being politically repressed in countries that are more open in the West? Or is this more likely to be a phenomenon that takes place in countries that are more susceptible to Russian pressure? So that's my first question. How should we think about this as varying across countries? The second question I have, and maybe this is best directed at Eric, is given the sort of historical pathway, and as you were talking about, like how different this is with the borders being open and the restrictions being on the parts of the host countries, but given, you know, as the state invests more and more resources in trying to track the activity of Russian exiles abroad, do you think that there's a potential that we could end up back in a situation like where we saw with the Soviet Union, where it becomes increasingly hard to leave the country because the surveillance state decides it's easier to surveil within the boundaries of Russia than having to put increasing resources into surveilling outside of Russia? And then the final question, which may be a little bit more for Iveta and Margarita, is how do you, but really to all of you, is how do you think about increasing levels of repression affecting the research enterprise in which you and many others are engaged right now, of trying to understand, study, and in a way give voice to this exile community? You know, from a survey standpoint, and Iveta, you and I have talked about this before, right? Like, from a survey standpoint, does this begin to answer the people who are willing to answer your surveys? But, you know, more generally, how does this increasing repression affect that? So we have, you know, slightly under 10 minutes left. So it's enough time for each of you to talk for a couple of minutes on this topic, on whichever of these questions you find most interesting. Elizaveta, you want to
go? Yes. So you suggest I start with the first one.
Whichever of those were three questions I had that were, you know, somewhat related, but whichever you would like to answer.
So talking about suppression or any discrimination for the Russian community, what I observed that suppression comes in paradox. Suppression comes in the countries which were easily reached from the very beginning of the war. We can see here like a correlation, like a negative correlation. The easiest country to reach at the beginning is the hardest, the hardest for Russian immigrants to exist then. For example, I can give you example exactly from journalistic community. So the first and very open country for Russian exile journalists was Georgia. Today, you'll find almost nobody there. So the question is why? Because after all these situations on the border control, after all these situations with foreign agent laws, of course, it has nothing to do with Russian journalists, but still, you know, like echo is very, very negative. So it all was summarized, but well, Georgia, why not Georgia? Georgia is tax haven. It's very close to Russia. It's very similar time zone. It's very easy to live there, but it's not safe if you are doing some kind of political activism or journalism. It's not safe. It's not clear how long you can stay there without changing rules inside the country. So, and as far as I can see, people are moving towards European Union and US in this situation. So the same situation was in Turkey. As soon as many Russians came to Turkey and starting like getting permits, tourist and citizen permits, living permits there, Turkish government banned these permits, and people started leaving Turkey towards European Union and other countries. So regarding European Union, for example, I don't see any problems specifically created for Russian community, except those that are related to sanctions. So I'm saying that in a way the sanctions, in the way they were started now, they have unfortunately a lot of collateral damage towards anti-Putin community as well, because they suffer a lot from financial restrictions and mostly from financial system restrictions, and that's of course the problem. I hope I answered at least part of your question.
That was great. Eric, do you want to maybe speak a moment towards this question of whether you see this evolving in a more Soviet direction as time goes by?
Sure. I mean, I mentioned the targeting of emigres abroad, and I think you're going to see different forms of targeting in different countries. So, as was mentioned, Kyrgyzstan is a place where Russian intelligence can operate more or less freely. I think Armenia and Georgia are places that do not have capacity, or sometimes not always the will to prevent these things. In countries, say in the U.S. or Western Europe, you're more likely to see surveillance, slander, disinformation. Although this assassination of the helicopter pilot in Spain was quite shocking and certainly meant to send a signal. Right. I don't know if this would have taken place in the U.S., but we do sort of see a growing boldness to test what they can get away with and to test the capacity of Western intelligence to respond. In terms of whether borders will close, I mean, again, I don't think we'll see the full level of enclosure we saw during the Soviet period, but I think a lot depends on how the war progresses. It's awkward to say this, but Ukraine actually has much tighter exit restrictions right now than Russia for men of fighting age, because they need soldiers for the army, and so if Russia is in a position where they need a full-scale mobilization, I think we'll see much tighter restrictions. Until then, I think we're going to see the targeted use of extradition, which was mentioned earlier, which we've seen in Kyrgyzstan in particular. So I think a lot will depend on how things go. Another factor that could lead to more tighter borders would be if there is a real groundswell of political protest against Putin. If internal punishment, of large groups of people becomes an easiest way of breaking up protests. But a lot depends on how things go.
Okay, thank you so much, Eric. And Iveta and Margarita, I'll give you guys the last word. You can answer any of it you want, but I don't know if you've thought about the sort of research implications of this as well.
For the research implications part, I think considering the fear of repression, how it may affect any research endeavors, currently we have Riswell coming back to answer the next level of our survey, which is considered quite high, given that we don't incentivize participants financially. And from methodological and ethical point of view, I think that we as researchers should definitely be very transparent about the data storage and how we use the data, and to give as much information as possible back to the community, so people understand why will they risk to participate in that sort of survey, why will they need it, and how their contribution matters. And I also wanted to maybe add some data on repression, question about repression. I find it very interesting that people are afraid of repression from Russia more or less on the same level in no matter what country they're currently in. Like in Georgia, in Armenia, they see in Germany, we see more or less the same level of fear of repression from Russia, but repression from host country is very different in many countries that I think it also show us how landscape is different.
Margarita, final words?
Yeah, very briefly on the safety of informants and respondents, and actually also researchers who actually conduct research. So if we publish op-eds or if we participate in podcasts, so it also has implication for Iveta, for me, or for anyone else, for Elizaveta, I bet. So it also kind of imposes restriction on how much we can actually publicly say what's going on within the diaspora. So when we kind of constantly are very well aware, can we publicize that, or we better just, stay put. So this is also kind of, it comes with lots of second order dilemmas, I would say, something that needs to be taken into account. And about the transnational repression, so when it comes to different political contexts, I absolutely agree with Elizaveta, of course, being Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, the easier countries in a way that are more convenient are actually the most dangerous. Kavchek issued a wonderful guidelines, very sad and wonderful, of course, quote unquote, providing guidelines whether it's safe for exiles to stay and what kind of activities they can conduct there. But when it comes to kind of countries with the rule of law, with good human rights institutions, etc., political institutions that protect human rights, etc. So, well, there are other ways how the homeland can affect the activities of those people. For instance, when it comes to income or relatives, so-called proxy repression, something that is actually being deployed to exercise pressure on journalists coming from North Caucasus. So these kind of instruments are still available, and in this case, it doesn't really matter whether a person is in Germany or is in Kazakhstan. So in this sense, it still kind of can reach out to those people and have a significant impact on their activities. That's all for me. Thank you for asking these questions.
Thank you very much. And we're now at time. So on behalf of the Harriman Institute and the Jordan Center, let me thank all the participants. There's tremendous thanks to you for joining, your insights, your expertise, your research. Also, thank you to all the attendees for your insightful questions and being with us. And thanks to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for supporting this series. I'll just say one last thing. We have another last event in this series on May 14, same time. This is going to be focused on sort of continuing the line from today and Russian security services and their operations since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So please look for announcements from us and join us in our next events. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you all so much.